Hi everyone, so in this video we'll talk a little bit about the creative process. So remember from last class we talked about the study done by psychiatry professor Albert Rothenberg, where he looked at various creative people to figure out what was the commonalities that they all shared, and he said, look, I found one thing in common. And it wasn't diet, it wasn't upbringing, it wasn't IQ. Do you remember what he found to be the common trait amongst these creative people? He said the one common bond between all who think differently is their willingness to do so, right? It's about their motivation, it's about their drive. But obviously, that isn't all you need, right? I mean, you've probably experienced this for yourself when you've wanted to find a creative solution, when you've wanted to find a way to write your paper in the middle of the night when you can't think of anything else to write. And you've probably had situations where you're really motivated, but you still weren't able to create something. So, what about creative blocks? Well, let's take a look at what creative blocks are in the first place, and then we'll talk about motivation in a second. So, what are creative blocks? You remember from our textbook, we saw this puzzle. A man is born in 1990 and dies in 2010. According to his death certificate, the man died when he was 25 years old. Well, the question is how? How is this even possible? For most of us stuck in our ordinary world, right, this seems impossible. How could somebody that was born in 1990 and die in 2010, how could they be 25? Right? Using traditional ideas, traditional understanding, using our conditioned stories of how to make sense out of this scenario, a lot of us get stuck in our ordinary world. Well, think back. Do you remember how this was possible? If you don't remember and just want to think about it for yourself for a second, go ahead and press pause and then restart again when you're ready. So remember, in this particular case, 1990 and 2010 doesn't refer to years, which would be the traditional, right? If you're looking at our definitions of creativity from the last class, those would be our traditional perspectives. That would be our ordinary world of those two words. This would be the way we've been conditioned to interpret those two words. But in this case, a man is born in 1990 and dies in 2010. Those could refer to hospital room numbers. So a person could be born in 1990 and die in 2010 and be of any age. But we get stuck, right? We get stuck in our ordinary world. We get stuck with our conditioned story. We get stuck trapped by our traditional ideas and perceptions that it makes it hard for us to venture beyond them. So how can we define creative blocks then? Well, let's move my face first, and then we'll take a closer look at this. Well, that gives us a sense that creative blocks then are the inability to see, to imagine from a different point of view. Creative blocks is being limited to your initial habitual dominant assumptions and perspectives. So notice that 1990 and 2010, you had an initial response to it, right? Your initial understanding of it. And that initial understanding is probably habitual, meaning every time you see those 1990, 2010, you habitually have a certain way of understanding it. And that understanding becomes your dominant assumption of what you think it means. Because obviously 1990, 2010 can mean lots of different things. It could be hospital room numbers. It could be home addresses. It could be, if you want, maybe somebody named their baby 1990 and 2010, right? But you have a dominant assumption about what those mean because you've lived life and those often mean years, right? So it becomes a dominant assumption. That means you have a particular perspective that has been useful to you when trying to interpret the words 1990 and 2010. But do you see how those dominant assumptions and habitual perceptions, they limit us? They're good in one sense because it makes it easy for us to act and live in the world, but they limit us, right? They limit us to an only narrow perspective, which is why you can also think of creative blocks as being a narrow or shallow sense of meaning, right? The words 1990, 2010, your access to what they means was narrowed, so you only saw them as being years. Creative blocks, Well, that's when your perception is narrowed. Think about staring at a blank canvas. Why do we sometimes get stuck thinking about what to put? Whether it's a little blank canvas where you're painting or a blank page where you're typing your paper. Why are you sometimes stuck not knowing what to paint next or to type next? Well, if we take your initial dominant perception here, what is it you're staring at? What does it mean? Well, it's literally a blank canvas. That's what it means. And if you only see the blank canvas, then you're stuck to that narrow sense of meaning. Being creative has to do with expanding your access to meaning. What else could this be? What else could it mean to you? So, seemingly, then, another aspect of being creative is living meaningfully, seeing meaningfully, experiencing the world meaningfully. So now we might have a little better sense of all that entails to be creative. I mean, the entire class will go through this, but as of right now, we know that you're going to need to be motivated to be creative, but you're also going to need to exercise that part of the brain that's able to access multiple meanings. You're going to have to access those skills that allow you to take on different perspectives, to take on different points of view. So that requires practice. So our class will be geared a lot towards practice and exercise. But what's also useful would be to understand how. How is it I'm supposed to get from point A, my ordinary world, to point B, manifesting something different? Understanding that process, being given a map of all the obstacles that might get in your way, well, that could be a little bit useful. So that's why a majority of our class will be spent understanding this creative process. Another way to think about understanding the creative process is also about understanding the creative mind. Because to understand the creative process is to understand what sort of mind you'll need to go through that process, right? What is it that I will have to do, right? What sorts of thoughts and thinking do I need to implement in order to go through all the different things that will be part of manifesting something unique in the world, something different? Now, when we take a look at these various artists from last class, these various creative people from last class, they all went through this creative process. When we take a look at all of these examples of final projects for our class, they all went through this creative process. Well, if we were to ask people what this process looks like, they may come up with lots of different ways of describing it, right? And you read about this for today. So we're not going to go through too much detail about all the examples or all different ways you can describe the creative process, but we'll just quickly go through them together, right? So for a lot of people, they say the creative process is about being born as a creative genius, right? It's not something you do, it's something that you are. So they'll point to people like Einstein and say, well, there's no way I can be like that, right? He was just born with this natural gift. The creative process is really about being born a creative genius. But do you remember what Einstein's school teacher said about him? Einstein's school teacher said of Einstein, he was a little bit slow. Doesn't really sound like somebody that was born with some sort of inherent genius, does it? Yet here's a man that completely revolutionized our understanding of reality, our understanding of time and space. Yet his teacher said, he was mentally slow. So is the creative process really just about being born a genius? People will also point to somebody like Mozart and say, look, another example of someone who was born as a creative genius. If you're not familiar with Mozart, or if you forgot from the reading, right? Mozart was considered a creative genius because seemingly he was born to be able to write musical compositions at an early age. At the age of 5, he already had compositions created, right? Musical pieces. Well, that's pretty insane. How could you do that unless you were just born with creative genius? Well, if we take a closer look at Mozart's life, remember, he was actually pretty lucky because he was born to a father who was already an accomplished musician, right? So it wasn't as if Mozart popped out of the womb being able to play piano. He had a father that could teach him to play piano. But also, Mozart worked really hard. right? He would practice for hours and hours every day. And there are stories about how his hands would look crippled because of how hard he pushed himself. So being able to come up with these compositions wasn't maybe as natural as many people believe. So as a result, some people have this new perspective on the process. Maybe creativity is about hard work and luck. Because for Mozart, he was really lucky to have been born to a certain father, musically gifted father, and he worked really hard to hone his craft. And there's lots of examples you read about in the textbook of people who worked really hard in their field and then an accident happened, right? And then something random occurred, but because they worked so hard in their field, they were able to use their knowledge to take advantage of the accident. And that's the case here with the Kellogg brothers. So remember who the Kellogg brothers are? If you didn't get to the reading yet, just try to think, where have you heard that name before? Well, originally the Kellogg brothers had the business in oats, right? Because they would produce oatmeal. Well, one day they had this bad batch of oats, and because of their hard work in their business, they wanted to make this profitable and came up with the idea of, maybe we can eat that bad batch of oats too. And they came up with cornflakes. As a result of an accident, they took advantage of it based upon their hard work, right? They gave them the knowledge on how to take advantage of it. And you'll have examples too of scientists who, accidentally leave certain things out for too long, and then they see that it does something that they would have never thought of creating before, right? And that becomes a new solution to a problem or a new remedy for an ailment. So maybe that's what creativity is. Just work really hard, just keep your nose to the grindstone, and then you'll stumble upon some creative idea. You'll be struck, or you'll run into an accident. You'll just take advantage of it because of how hard you've worked, that you become so knowledgeable in your field. Some people look at creativity almost strictly as about intersecting streams, putting together things that had never been put together before. So nowadays, people drink iced coffee all the time, but not too long ago, that was a crazy idea. Coffee. What was the ordinary world of coffee? Well, it's something you brew that when you drink, you want nice steam to be flowing out of it because you want it piping hot. And all of a sudden, people mix that with coffee and then that with other stuff like creams and sugars and a whole bunch of different things. And now you have iced coffee and variations of those. Have you ever heard of the band Queen or the song Bohemian Rhapsody? Well, if you're unfamiliar with Bohemian Rhapsody, it's a song that has a really interesting mix of various genres of music, in particular rock and operatic music, right? Two genres nobody ever thought of putting together before. And it's by putting those two genres together that Queen came up with a really interesting, unique song. Or take, for instance, something that you're all very familiar with, if not obsessed over, and that's your cell phone. The idea of a phone used to be just to talk to one another. What does that thing do for you now? I bet you spend more time doing other things other than talking to one another. You might use your phone to take photographs or take videos or to watch videos or to watch movies or to check mail. Right? You say that phrase like 10, 15 years ago, people would be like, checking mail on a phone? What does that even mean? You use it to make calculations, use it to check weather, use it to chart, data points. You can use it to get knowledge by doing web searches. In fact, there's so many things your phone can do. What makes that device creative? Well, some people go, it's intersecting all of these things that had not been put together before. So is that what creativity is? Well, some people think it's kind of the opposite of that. So they'll use this phrase divergent thinking to refer to creativity. Creativity is all about divergent thinking. Well, what does that mean? The opposite of divergent is convergent. So convergent means we want everybody to converge onto the one right answer. Or we want everybody to think and think until we all come to the one optimal solution or the one best approach, right? We're all coming to converge to one idea. Divergent means the opposite. You're going out. You want to get as many ideas as you can. You want to stray away from what everybody else might think and diverge from them. In this sense, people say what creativity really is about stepping out of the common stream, right? Another way of phrasing this comes from psychologist Edward de Bono, and he uses the phrase lateral thinking. So if you are part of a company, companies will often have people come in to teach lateral thinking skills. There are tons of books on the bookshelves that teach lateral thinking techniques, or they'll be full of lateral thinking puzzles. These are all puzzles that are meant to help you think divergently, think away from the mainstream. Here is an example that we can use to get a sense for lateral thinking, for divergent thinking. Poor Joe has been wanting to go home for such a long time. He's been dreaming of this since he was a kid. But now he gets his chance. He's met with a man in a mask who prevents him from attaining his dream. What's going on? So whatever your initial image, right, in your head of what's happening, that's your ordinary world. And I bet you a lot of people that are watching this are going to have a very similar ordinary world understanding, right? But divergent means to go away from that, to diverge from it, or to say it with the Bono's terms, to think laterally, to step off to the side of the normal understanding, right, and approach it from a different path. So let's think about this. Poor Joe's been wanting to go home for such a long time. Well, how are you interpreting that? What's the common understanding of what that is? And can you diverge from it? Can you go in a different direction, right? Move laterally from it? He's been dreaming of this since he was a kid, but now he gets his chance. But now that he gets his chance, he's met with a man in a mask. Okay, well, what's your initial idea or image of a man in a mask? Who would that be? Okay, whatever your ordinary world is, can you step out of that stream? Can you diverge from it? Can you step to the side of it and take a different approach to who you're imagining a man in a mask would look like, or what a man in a mask would look like? Pause the video if you want to spend a little more time thinking about this. But in this particular case, Joe is playing baseball. And if you know anything about baseball, you want to score runs. And the way to score runs is you go around the bases and you come back home. And there's a player on the opposing team that doesn't want you to come home. And that's the catcher. And he always is there at home base, usually. Not always, but usually. And the catcher oftentimes wears a mask. So how could you manifest that idea? Well, according to this approach, it's by thinking divergently or by thinking laterally. Some people will say the creative process is really about unconscious processing, meaning there's lots of stories and examples of people who come up with creative ideas when they sleep or when they rest or when they just step away from the problem, because that's when they allow their mind to work on it in the background while they consciously deal with something else. Lots of stories about how artists wake up and have a vision for what to paint, or they'll take a nap and wake up and have the plot of a story outlined in their heads. Or people that have problems and they just go on vacation and think about something completely different while their unconscious is working on the problem in the background. I mean, have you ever been working on paper and then you just get stuck and don't know what to do, so you just turn off your computer because you gave up, and it's right at that moment you turned off your computer that you have an idea of what to write next? Or have you ever lost your keys and you look and you look and you look, and it's when you stop looking that you find them? For a lot of people, this is what creativity is about. It's about letting go. It's about letting the mind unconsciously work to create something new and be consciously open enough to allow those new ideas to arise. Some people will say, no, creativity, this process is really about an altered state of mind. Not just sleeping or restful state, but a literal altered state where you either use substances to alter your mind or you happen to be born genetically with certain psychological predispositions. So, for instance, lots of stories about artists who ingest certain substances, take certain substances, smoke certain things, drink certain liquids, in order to get in a state that they feel is more creative. Or there are some people that are born with psychological disorders, anxiety, depression. In fact, when we take a look at a lot of artists, we see that there is a pretty decent amount of artists who suffer from psychological disorders. So it feels as if the mind has to be a little bit different, a little bit off in order to be creative. Is that necessarily true, though? Is that something that has to happen to be creative? As we've seen, and as you will see, not necessarily the case, right? Some people will say what the process is really about is about opening yourself up and allowing some other source to create through you. And in fact, if we were to ask people 100 years ago, what's the source of their creativity? This would often be the common answer. You ask an artist, well, how did you come up with the idea for that painting? They'll say, God gave it to me, right? You ask a musician, well, how did you come up with that composition? How did you come up with that song? So beautiful lyrics. God gave it to me. It was oftentimes attributed to God. So within this description of the creative process, creativity is about becoming a channel for a higher power and letting that higher power work through you. And lastly, what we see with modern science getting better and better ways of looking at the workings of our brain is we start to see an emphasis on creativity as being something that neurologically occurs in the brain. Now remember, the brain is made up of different cells, different brain cells called neurons, and these neurons all talk to each other in these vast networks, kind of like a telephone network, or kind of like imagine a spider web like you see in your screen. And when you learn something, right, these brain cells, these neurons, start to make connections. And the more that you're used to something, the stronger particular connections get. So let's say you're learning a language, right? You become more familiar with the language, then the more connected certain brain cells get to one another so that they can easily communicate, so that you easily remember what you learned. This is why the more and more times you are accustomed to seeing something a certain way, or you're accustomed to having a certain approach to a problem, that becomes ingrained in you. Well, this is where the phrase, you can't teach an old dog new tricks, comes from. But what we see with new science is that you can learn new tricks, right? You can develop a way for your mind to alter those neural connections. So when people think about creativity in some fields like neuroscience, they'll say things like you need to create unique neural activation patterns. Lots of different ways of looking at the creative process, right? So many different perspectives. Why? Why are there so many different ways of describing how to be creative? Which one's right? Which one's the best? Which one's the best for you? Well, there may not really be a best. One way to think about why there's so many perspectives is to go back to the story of the blind villagers that you read about in your textbook. Just to refresh your memory, the story is about these individuals, these blind men who live in this village, and then one day an elephant comes through town. Now, none of these blind men had ever experienced an elephant, and they all get really excited because finally they get to know what an elephant is. So they all they're all led to the elephant, and they start to experience the elephant. One man says, "Oh, I know what an elephant is now. An elephant's like a coarse rope," as he's touching the elephant's tail. The man next to him says, "What do you mean, coarse rope? The elephant is obviously more like a brick wall," as it's touching the elephant's torso. Another blind man says, "What are you two talking about? It's obvious that an elephant's more like a pillar," as he's holding and hugging the elephant's leg. Another blind man says, "You guys are insane. There is no way you guys are actually experiencing an elephant, because an elephant is actually more like a snake," as the blind man is touching the elephant's trunk. And they all begin to argue nonstop about what an elephant is. If you were one of these men, how could you avoid this argument? Well, one thing you might want to do is to be more open to another person's perspective, another person's point of view. And by being more open to another person's perspective and point of view, you might even get a better, more complete picture of the elephant. So, same thing with creativity. In fact, creativity is about being more open, isn't it? Creativity is about being open to another person's perspective, another point of view, to get a more complete picture of something. In our case, though, we're going to focus on one particular approach to looking at the creative process. And for me, it just so happens to be an approach that I think encompasses all of the other approaches we looked at earlier. And there's a particular reason why we're going to be approaching the creative process in this way. We'll be approaching the creative process through the lens of the hero's journey. Now, you may have heard about this through your classes in myth or classes in literature, or maybe if you took a class in screenwriting. What does this refer to? Well, there was a mythologist named Joseph Campbell. Now, a mythologist is somebody that studies myths. So Joseph Campbell was studying myths from various different cultures, and he noticed that every culture had a major myth about a hero. But what was particularly interesting was that every hero myth from every culture seemed to have the same pattern. Now, what's unique about this? Well, what's unique about this is that these cultures, right, developed these hero stories, these heroic myths, independent of one another, right? There was no way that they were able to share and transmit knowledge between them all. So as these civilizations popped up and grew separately, you would think they'd have different cultures, which they did. Yet, the major stories they would tell themselves, the major stories all had the same pattern with all of the other cultures' major stories. Well, what's that pattern? All of these stories seem to take place at first, in the main character's ordinary world. Right? You introduce the main character and we see them in their ordinary existence. Think about this with any story you're familiar with, or any movie you see. Aren't we usually introduced to the main character in like their normal life? Right? Think about the Star Wars franchise, how we see Luke in this desert home, right? This is like a poor kid in a desert planet. Same thing with Rey and the most recent Star Wars franchise, right? Desert planet, the ordinary life. Think about any superhero movie where we find out about the superhero's origin story, their ordinary life before they gain the superpowers. All of these sort of heroic stories always introduce us to the hero in their ordinary world. And at some point within the story, there is a call to leave that world behind, a call away from their home to go out to experience adventure. And it's scary because they're leaving their world behind. But eventually, all of these heroes, they do it. They cross the threshold between their world and the new one, and then they enter this new place, right? The sea of possibilities, because now they're in the land where they're not familiar with things. So it's full of possibilities for themselves. And when they enter, they experience hardship, trials and tribulations, right? They battle demons, they battle the bad guys, they battle obstacles that come from the new town or the new city that they've moved to. Think about the Karate Kid and how Daniel LaRusso, if you know the Karate Kid, moves to LA and he has to battle and deal with all the bullies at his high school, right? Have to overcome all the setbacks that they face in this new place. All of these obstacles that they did not have to deal with in their ordinary world. And in all these stories, at some point, they all kind of crash, don't they? There's always some point where things get really bad. So this is what we call they approach the inmost cave, or what we see also in these dark times is they get something, they retrieve something, something happens that changes everything, right? They find a new potion, they find the right teacher, they find the right spell, they get the right sword, they find the key piece of information, something comes to them that turns everything around. And then they can go back home victorious. They win the big battle, they win the championship, they They find and rescue the damsel in distress. They restore order to the kingdom. Something happens as a result of them finding that one key thing that allows them to return home as conquering heroes. Every story, every culture, says Campbell, you see this same monomyth, the same structure for all of these stories. So the question I want you to think about is why? Why would all of these cultures share the same heroic pattern? You might be moved to say something like, well, because that's what a good story sounds like, right? The hero has to go through problems. The hero has to go through a dark time, right? Otherwise, it wouldn't be a good story. The question I want you to think about is why would that be a good story? Why would it be a good story for you? Why is that a good story for all of these cultures? Let's take a look at this again. Some psychologists will say, look, the reason why you see this same pattern in all of these cultures' stories about heroes is because this is the inherent pattern of what it means to live a human life. Isn't this the pattern that you're going through or have gone through? At some point in your life, you had to leave your ordinary world behind, didn't you? I mean, if you've moved here from another country, you left that country to start this adventure and to transform and create something new for yourself. If you were living with your parents, at some point you move out, have your own place. So you leave your ordinary world behind and you start to venture out into the sea of possibilities where you're met with trials and tribulations like bills, like dealing with electric companies and phone companies and the internet companies and dealing with rowdy neighbors and right. These are your trials and tribulations of being out on your own. Or maybe you left a job to venture out into a different career. I mean, that's why you're at our college. Well, you left your ordinary world. You answered the call to adventure to try something new, and maybe you've noticed it's not so easy to start a new career. There's lots of trials and tribulations. At some point in our lives, we all go through this because this is the natural process for growth. This is the natural process for change. And our lives are in continual change, isn't it? Isn't this the case? So when we are going to be taking a look at this model as our model for creativity, one, it seems to work in a very good way, a very clean way, as we talked about before with our ordinary world analogy and leaving that behind to manifest something new. But two is because in our class we're focusing on creativity not just for the sake of creating new things, but because this is what you go through in life. You are from moment to moment creating yourself. You are from moment to moment creating your life. And would it be useful to figure out all the ups and downs and all the obstacles that get in the way of you making the life that you want to live? So this is why we'll approach the creative process in this way. Because apparently there really is one story, right? And it's the story that we all live as human beings.